Chicago in the winter of 1958 was a city of stark contrasts. The glittering skyline along the lakefront promised a bright, modern future. But in the sprawling industrial backlots and the decaying brick canyons of the South Side, the past clung on with greasy, tenacious fingers. The stockyards, once the pulsating heart of the city's wealth, were now a landscape of rust and ghosts, their pungent aroma a permanent stain on the frigid air. It was here, in a disused slaughterhouse, that the first body was found. The victim was a man named Artie the Lip Bellini, a small-time bookmaker with big-time debts. He was found by a beat cop on a routine patrol, a patrol that had become anything but routine. Artie was slumped against a blood-rusted stanchion. His life ended not by a bullet, a common currency in his world, but by a single, precise slash across his throat. The scene was clean, professional, and utterly devoid of the chaotic rage that usually accompanied gangland killings. The detail that made the veteran cop's blood run cold, however, was not the wound. It was the watch. A cheap, dime-store pocket watch, its crystal smashed, its hands frozen in place, had been placed on Artie's chest. The time it showed was 3:17 in the morning. The case landed on the desk of Detective Leo Jigsaw Pirelli, a second-generation Italian-American with a rumpled suit and a mind that worked like a trap. Pirelli was a man who believed the world, in all its chaos, could be understood if you found the right pieces and forced them to fit. He was obsessive, driven, and haunted by the cases that didn't close. The scene at the slaughterhouse presented a puzzle piece that was warped, alien, and didn't belong. A watch. His partner, Detective Frank Kowalski, a large, pragmatic man with a deep-seated distrust of anything that smelled of theatrics, had grunted. So the guy's watch broke when he fell. So what? He didn't fall, Frank, Pirelli had replied, his eyes fixed on the broken timepiece, carefully bagged as evidence. This isn't his. Artie Bellini wore a gold Rolex, a gift from a grateful client. This is a piece of junk. And look at the time. 3:17. Artie was at an all-night poker game on Taylor Street until 4. His alibi is airtight for that time. So why this time? Why this watch? The investigation into Bellini's life yielded the usual suspects. Rival bookies, loan sharks, a cuckolded husband, but none of them fit the profile of a killer who would leave such a bizarre, meticulous calling card. The watch was a message, but a message in a language Pirelli couldn't yet decipher. It was an anomaly, a splinter in the smooth narrative of a gangland hit. He felt the familiar, gnawing itch of a pattern beginning to form, a pattern with only one data point. He knew, with a detective's cold intuition, that there would be more. 2 weeks later, his grim foreboding was confirmed. The second body was found in a flophouse room near the Loop. The victim was Sarah Jennings, a faded vaudeville singer, who had long since traded the spotlight for the shadowy world of prostitution. Her death was different, a struggle, a brutal bludgeoning, but the signature was the same. On her chest lay a woman's wristwatch, its delicate face shattered, its hands stopped at 9:42 in the evening. 2 victims, 2 different worlds, 2 different methods of killing, one unifying, terrifying symbol, a broken watch forever marking a time that had no apparent connection to their deaths. The press, smelling a story, dubbed the unknown killer the Clockmaker. Pirelli hated the name. It sounded too clean, too skilled. This felt darker, more broken. To him, it was the case of the broken watches, a symphony of stopped time played for an audience of one. Himself. A small-time bookie and a faded showgirl are dead. Their only connection, a shattered watch left on their chests, each frozen at a different, seemingly random time. Detective Pirelli sees a pattern where others see coincidence. the first notes in a killer's symphony. But what is the melody? What connects a time of 3:17 in a slaughterhouse to 9:42 in a flophouse? The key lies not in the victims, but in the times themselves. To uncover the first clue hidden within the stopped hands, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of this investigation. With 2 victims, the broken watch case was officially a serial investigation. A special task force was assembled, and Pirelli, despite his unorthodox methods, was placed in charge due to his early recognition of the pattern. He set up a war room in the precinct, its walls soon plastered with crime scene photos, victim profiles, and a large city map. The 2 watches, now evidence numbers 1 and 2, sat on his desk in clear plastic bags, their frozen faces staring out like dead eyes. The victims, Artie Bellini and Sarah Jennings, were a study in contrasts. Bellini moved in a world of calculated risk and violent debt. Jennings existed in a sphere of desperation and fleeting transactions. Pirelli's team dug into their pasts, searching for a crossover, a shared acquaintance, a common location, a mutual enemy. They found nothing. The only link was the killer's signature. Dr. Aris Thorne, the department's forensic psychiatrist, was brought in to profile the unknown subject. She was a woman of sharp intellect and sharper intuition, her gaze seeming to see through the layers of a crime to the fractured mind beneath. "The watch is the core of his ritual," she told Pirelli and Kowalski, standing before the grisly gallery of photos. "The killing itself is almost secondary. The method varies, suggesting practicality over passion. The throat slash for Bellini was efficient. The bludgeoning for Jennings was messy, likely because she fought back. But the placement of the watch, that is where he invests his meaning. That is the act that truly matters to him." "But what's the meaning, Doc?" Kowalski asked, frustration evident in his voice. "Is he marking the time of death? Because he's not. Is it the time he wanted to kill them? That's just creepy." "It's more profound than that," Dr. Thorne said. "He's not marking a moment in the present. He's referencing a moment in the past, a moment that was, for him, when something broke. The watches are symbolic. They represent time that has stopped, a life interrupted, a moment of trauma frozen forever. He's projecting his own broken time onto his victims." Pirelli listened, his eyes fixed on the evidence bags. 3:17, 9:42. He had been poring over train schedules, shift changes, radio broadcast logs, anything that might correspond to those times. Nothing fit. But Dr. Thorne's words sparked a new thought. What if the times weren't about the victim's present, but their own past, or the killer's? He ordered his team to do a deep dive into the lives of Bellini and Jennings, focusing on the dates in their histories that corresponded to the times on the watches. For Bellini, they looked for an event at 3:17 in the morning. For Jennings, 9:42 in the evening. It was a needle in a haystack, a shot in the dark. It was a junior detective, fresh out of the academy, who found the first thread. While cross-referencing old police reports with Bellini's known associates, he found a buried file from 1949, a warehouse fire. The alarm was called in at 3:16 in the morning. One casualty, a night watchman named Patrick Flynn. The fire was ruled an accident, faulty wiring, but the detective noted a connection. Arthur Bellini's first cousin, a man named Vinny, had been the primary suspect in an insurance fraud scheme involving that very warehouse. The case was dropped for lack of evidence. Pirelli felt a jolt of adrenaline. It wasn't the exact time, but it was close, damningly close.
3:16, 3:17. Was it a mistake, an approximation, or was the watch not showing a time of day, but a reference to a time-stamped event? He turned to the Jennings case, 9:42 at night. They scoured her history. She had been a rising star in the late 30s, performing at the Chicago Palace Theater. They pulled the playbills, the reviews, and they found it. On the night of October 12, 1938, the Chicago Palace Theater had a catastrophic collapse of a stage rigging during the 9 o'clock show. Several stagehands were injured. The show was stopped at 9:42 p.m. Sarah Jennings was the headline act that night. Her career never recovered. The trauma, both physical and psychological, sent her into a downward spiral from which she never emerged. The pattern was no longer a theory. It was a fact. The killer was marking his victims with the time of a past, traumatic event that had defined or destroyed their lives. Bellini connected to a fatal fire at 3:17 a.m. Jennings connected to a career-ending accident at 9:42 p.m. The broken watch was a monument to their personal ruin. The killer wasn't just a murderer. He was a historian of tragedy, an archaeologist of despair. And he was just getting started. The killer's pattern is cracked. The broken watches do not show the time of death, but the time of a pivotal, life-shattering event from the victim's past. He's a curator of catastrophe, hunting those who have already been broken by fate and finishing the job. But how does he know these intimate, often buried details? And why is he doing this now? The investigation must shift from tracking a random serial killer to uncovering a master manipulator with an uncanny knowledge of other people's secret sorrows. The hunt for a ghost who collects tragedies is on. To discover how the killer selects his victims and what third ruin he will unearth, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The revelation transformed the investigation. They were no longer looking for a random psychopath, but for a planner, a researcher, someone with either an official capacity or a terrifyingly efficient network of informants. Pirelli theorized the killer had access to records, police files, fire department reports, hospital archives, newspaper morgues. He was building a ledger of human ruin and methodically working his way through it. The task force was split. One team, led by Kowalski, began the monumental task of cross-referencing all reported traumatic incidents in Chicago over the past 20 years with their associated times, looking for a potential list of future victims. It was a Sisyphean task. The city's history was written in pain and accident. Pirelli and Dr. Thorne took a different tack. They focused on the killer's psychology. He's not just punishing them, Dr. Thorne mused, staring at the timeline they had created. He's completing them. In his mind, their lives effectively ended at that moment. The watch stopped. He sees himself as a mercy killer, ending a life that has been a ghost for years. Or perhaps he's avenging the past itself. The watch is a tombstone for a death that already happened. But why these two? Pirelli asked. Why Artie Bellini and Sarah Jennings? There must be thousands of people in Chicago who have suffered a traumatic, time-stamped event. What makes them special? The answer came with the third victim, and it was chilling than any of the first two. The body was found in a quiet, well-kept bungalow in the Northwest Side. The victim was Eleanor Vance, a 68-year-old retired librarian. She had been suffocated with a pillow, a quiet, almost gentle death compared to the others. On her chest was a delicate silver-chained locket watch, its face cracked, its hands frozen, at 4:08 in the afternoon. The time, 4:08 p.m., meant nothing in the context of a librarian's quiet life, but Pirelli knew to dig deeper. He dispatched detectives to search Eleanor Vance's home for clues to her personal trauma. They found it in a dusty box in the attic, a framed newspaper article from the Chicago Tribune dated June 5th, 1924. The headline read, "School Tragedy. 10 children perish in ferry boat capsizing on school outing." The article detailed how a ferry carrying a class from St. Mary's Elementary School had overturned in the Chicago River. The teacher, a young woman named Eleanor Shipley, her maiden name, had been hailed a hero for saving 3 children before collapsing from exhaustion and shock. The ferry had capsized at 4:08 p.m. Eleanor Vance had never married, had never had children of her own. She had lived a life of quiet, bookish solitude, a life defined by a single, horrific afternoon when she was 24 years old. The killer knew. He knew about the capsizing, the time, and the profound, lifelong shadow it had cast on the woman she became. This victim changed the profile. Eleanor Vance was a hero, not a compromised figure like Bellini or a tragic burnout like Jennings. The killer's selection was not based on moral judgment. It was solely based on the existence of a precise traumatic timestamp. He was an equal opportunity destroyer of those haunted by a specific minute in their past. The press, now in a frenzy, dubbed him the chronologist. Pirelli's task force was drowning in tips and potential leads, all of them dead ends. The killer was a ghost. His research impeccable, his methods clean. He left no fingerprints, no fibers, no witnesses. His only presence was the broken watch, a silent, mocking testament to his work. Pirelli, driven and sleepless, began to see the city not as a map of streets, but as a map of wounds. Every corner held a potential tragedy, every citizen a potential victim. The killer had a ledger, and he was working his way through it. But how was the ledger organized? Alphabetically, chronologically, by type of trauma? They had 3 data points: a fire, a stage accident, a ferryboat disaster. There was no pattern there. The breakthrough, when it came, was from an unexpected source. A sharp-eyed records clerk at Cook County Hospital noticed that all 3 victims at different times in their lives had been treated for shock or minor injuries at the same hospital, St. Jude's General, following their respected traumatic events. It was a thin thread, but it was the first connection between the victims themselves. The killer wasn't just using public records, he was using medical records. St. Jude's General became the new focus. The ledger was a patient file. The killer's source is uncovered. He's using the confidential medical records of St. Jude's General Hospital to find his victims, selecting them based on the timestamp of the trauma that brought them there. He's not a random predator, but a systematic hunter with access to privileged information. The hospital is the key. But who inside the hospital has access to decades-old records and a motive for this horrific campaign? A doctor? A nurse? An administrator? The hunt narrows to the sterile, echoing halls of St. Jude's, where a healer may be hiding the heart of a killer. To uncover the suspect lurking within the hospital's walls, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
St. Jude's General Hospital was an imposing brick edifice on the city's near west side, a place that had seen generations of Chicagoans pass through its doors in moments of pain, joy, and ultimate finality. Pirelli and his team descended on it with a quiet, grim determination. They couldn't publicly storm the place. The killer would be alerted and vanish. Instead, they worked with the hospital administration, a group of deeply concerned and terrified officials, to conduct a discreet internal audit. The scope was overwhelming. They were looking for someone with access to the central archives, which held paper records going back 50 years. The list of potential suspects was long: archivists, administrators, senior doctors with sweeping privileges, and a whole host of support staff. Pirelli interviewed them all, watching for a flicker of recognition, a nervous tick, a too-perfect alibi. He focused on those who had been at St. Jude's the longest. There was Dr. Lawrence Evans, the chief of staff, a man in his 60s who seemed to carry the weight of every death in the hospital on his stooped shoulders. There was Martha Higgins, the head archivist, a woman who knew the location of every file as if they were her own children. There was Samuel Jones, a janitor who had worked the night shift for 30 years, a silent, invisible presence who knew every corridor and every secret the hospital held. Each was plausible, each had opportunity, none had a discernible motive. While the interviews proceeded, Pirelli had his team pull the complete files for Bellini, Jennings, and Vance. He spent a long night in a borrowed hospital office, the 3 thick folders open before him. He was looking for another commonality, a name that appeared on all 3, a doctor who treated them, a nurse who signed their admission forms. And then he found it. It wasn't a person. It was a stamp. On the front of each file, in faded red ink, was a circular stamp that read, Trauma Psych Assessment, Dr. A. Silva. Dr. Alistair Silva. A name that didn't appear on the current staff roster. Pirelli's heart began to pound. He went to Martha Higgins, the archivist. Dr. Silva, she said, her brow furrowing. That's a name I haven't heard in years. Dr. Alistair Silva. He was our resident psychiatric trauma specialist. Brilliant man. A pioneer in understanding shock and long-term psychological injury. He retired. Must be 10 years now. Had a stroke, poor man. His mind was not what it was. He lives in a private care facility up in Lake Forest. A retired psychiatrist. A man who had dedicated his life to studying trauma. A man who had personally assessed all 3 victims in the immediate aftermath of their defining tragedies. He had not just read their files. He had looked into their eyes, heard their stories, understood the precise moment their lives had fractured. He was the perfect suspect. He had the knowledge, the access, and a motive that was now terrifyingly clear. Dr. Alistair Silva hadn't just studied trauma. He had become obsessed with it. In his possibly addled mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was a completionist. He was finishing the work that fate had started, putting suffering souls out of a misery that only he, in his godlike psychiatric perspective, could fully perceive. The broken watches were his diagnosis. Time of trauma, time of death, the ultimate closure. Pirelli and Kowalski drove to the Lake Forest Care Facility immediately. It was a serene, expensive place, all manicured lawns and silent hallways. The director confirmed that Dr. Silva was a resident. He was mostly nonverbal, wheelchair-bound, and required full-time care. He had not left the facility in over 5 years. They were shown to his room. Dr. Alistair Silva was a shrunken figure in a chair by the window, a blanket over his knees. He stared out at the frozen garden, his eyes vacant. He tried to speak to him, to show him the photographs of the watches, to mention the names Bellini, Jennings, Vance. There was no reaction. Nothing. A nurse confirmed that his condition had deteriorated significantly in the last year. It was impossible. He could not have planned and executed these complex murders. The lead, which had seemed so promising, evaporated into the sterile air of the nursing home. They were back to square one. Dejected, Pirelli prepared to leave. As he turned to go, his eyes fell on the small table next to Silva's chair. There was a book, a heavy, leather-bound volume. Its title was stamped in gold leaf on the spine, Chronologies of Catastrophe, a study in temporal trauma. The author was Dr. Alistair Silva. He picked it up. It wasn't a published book. It was a bound typescript, Silva's life's work. He flipped it open. It was a collection of case studies, each one detailing a patient, their trauma, and the exact time it occurred. It was his ledger. But Silva himself was just the author. Someone else was reading it. Someone else was using his research. The killer wasn't Dr. Silva. The killer was a disciple. The prime suspect is a broken, elderly man in a nursing home physically incapable of the murders. But his life's work, a book cataloging the precise timing of his patients' traumas, is the killer's blueprint. The chronologist is not the doctor, but someone who has access to his unpublished manuscript. A student? A colleague? A family member? The hunt shifts from finding the author to finding the fanatic who has turned academic research into a murderous manifesto. The killer is closer than they thought, a shadow who admired the doctor's work a little too much. To discover the identity of the disciple and his terrifying motivation, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
Began the painstaking process of cross-referencing every name in the manuscript with current addresses and vita status. It was a race against time. The killer was working from this list, and they had to identify potential victims before he could strike again. Meanwhile, Pirelli and Dr. Thorne focused on the potential disciples. They compiled a list of everyone who had worked closely with Dr. Silva: his former nurses, his research assistants, his protégés at the university. The most promising name was Dr. Michael Aldrich. Aldrich had been Silva's star resident in the late 1940s, a brilliant young psychiatrist who had co-authored several papers with him on post-traumatic stress. He was known to have been fiercely devoted to Silva, almost to the point of worship. After Silva's stroke, Aldrich had left St. Jude's and set up a private and very lucrative practice on Michigan Avenue, catering to the city's wealthy elite. Pirelli and Kowalski paid him a visit. Dr. Michael Aldrich was everything Silva was not: young, vibrant, impeccably dressed, radiating a calm, professional confidence. His office was a sanctuary of modern design and quiet luxury. "Dr. Silva was a mentor to me," Aldrich said smoothly when Pirelli mentioned the name. "A genius. His work on temporal fixation was decades ahead of its time. It's a tragedy what happened to him." "We found his manuscript," Pirelli said, watching Aldrich closely. "Chronologies of catastrophe." A flicker of something, recognition, longing, passed behind Aldrich's eyes so fast Pirelli almost missed it. "Ah, the masterwork. He never wanted to publish it. He believed the data was too pure, too raw for the commercial world. He considered it his private ledger of human pain." "Do you have a copy?" Kowalski asked bluntly. Aldrich smiled, a practiced, disarming expression. "I wish I did. I begged him for one. But he was very protective. He said understanding the precise moment of a psychic break was a sacred knowledge, that in the wrong hands it could be dangerous." He was clever. He was acknowledging the manuscript's power while simultaneously distancing himself from it. Pirelli had no grounds to search his office or his home. Aldrich's alibis for the times of the murders were, on the surface, impeccable. With patients, at the opera, giving a lecture. He was a pillar of the community, a man who healed minds, not a man who shattered them with broken watches. But Pirelli's instinct screamed at him. Aldrich was too perfect, too prepared. He had the knowledge, the philosophical framework, and the intelligence to plan the murders. He also had a potential motive, a twisted form of devotion. He was completing his mentor's work, moving from theory to practice. He was proving Silva's thesis in the most horrific way possible, that a life could be defined and justifiably ended by a single frozen moment in time. While they were building the circumstantial case against Aldrich, the killer struck again. The fourth victim was Franklin Nobili, a retired dock worker. He was found in his tiny apartment, a victim of carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace, a quiet domestic death. On his chest was a broken alarm clock. Its hand stopped at 11:09 at night. The team didn't need to dig far. Franklin Nobili's name was in Silva's manuscript. On July 4, 1942, a munitions ship being loaded at the docks had exploded. The blast, which occurred at 11:09 p.m., had killed 22 men and blinded Franklin in one eye. He had never worked again. The killer was definitely using the manuscript, and the pace was quickening. Pirelli was certain it was Aldrich, but he had no proof. He needed to force his hand. He decided on a risky strategy. He would use the press.
In a carefully managed leak, he let it be known that the investigation had a prime suspect and was closing in. He didn't name Aldrich, but he hinted strongly that the killer was a medical professional with a deep knowledge of psychiatry. He wanted to spook Aldrich, to make him feel the walls closing in. A cornered predator, Dr. Thorne warned, was often at its most dangerous and most prone to mistakes. The plan worked, but not in the way Pirelli expected. Aldrich didn't panic and run. He lawyered up, a high-powered attorney who threatened to sue the department for harassment. He became even more insulated, more untouchable. The pressure on Pirelli from his superiors intensified. They had a city in a state of panic and a detective obsessed with a respected doctor against whom he had no evidence. The stalemate was broken by a piece of evidence so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it had been overlooked. On the broken alarm clock left on Franklin Nobili's chest, the forensics team had found a partial fingerprint. It wasn't in the system, but it was a physical link to the killer. Now they had something to compare. All they needed was a match from Aldrich, but without probable cause, they couldn't force him to provide his prints. Pirelli was trapped. He had the suspect, he had the motive, he had the means, but he had no legal way to prove it. The clockmaker was hiding in plain sight, protected by his reputation and the letter of the law. Pirelli would have to find another way to get those fingerprints, a way that walked the line of his oath and his desperation to stop the killing. The killer is identified as Dr. Michael Aldrich, a brilliant psychiatrist using his mentor's research to execute a twisted philosophy of merciful murder. But he's a ghost in the machine, protected by his reputation and the law. Detective Pirelli has a partial fingerprint from the latest crime scene, but no way to match it to his prime suspect. The legal system has become the killer's shield. To stop the chronologist, Pirelli must now operate in the gray areas, risking his career to obtain the evidence that will bring him down. The line between justice and vengeance is about to blur. To see how Pirelli traps the untouchable doctor, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The legal impasse was suffocating. Pirelli knew with every fiber of his being that Dr. Michael Aldrich was the clockmaker, but knowing and proving were two different worlds. He couldn't get a warrant for fingerprints based on a hunch and the philosophical profile. He needed to catch Aldrich in the act, or trick him into revealing himself. He devised a plan so risky that even Kowalski balked at. It's entrapment, Leo, and if it goes wrong, it's your badge. Maybe worse. What's the alternative, Frank? Pirelli had retorted, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. Wait for him to kill again? He has a list of hundreds. We can't protect them all. We have to force his hand. The plan was built on Aldrich's own psychology. He was a perfectionist, a completist. His ritual was everything. Pirelli's team would create a false entry, a patient who fit the profile perfectly, and they would dangle this bait in front of Aldrich. They created an identity, Harold McNally, a retired train conductor. His trauma, according to the forged file they planted in the St. Jude's archives with the administration's terrified cooperation, was a horrific train derailment in 1951 that killed 14 people. The fake time of the accident was 2:24 in the afternoon. They then leaked this name to Aldrich through a convoluted chain of informants, making it seem like a newly discovered prime candidate from Silva's manuscript. The bait was set. They rented a small ground-floor apartment in a quiet neighborhood and filled it with the ephemera of an old man's life. Pirelli, wired for sound, would play the part of Harold McNally, a broken, reclusive man haunted by the memory of the derailment. The entire building and street were under surveillance. They waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. Pirelli, sitting in the stale air of the apartment, felt the plan crumbling. Aldrich was too smart. He had seen through it. On the fourth afternoon, at precisely 2:24, the doorbell rang. Pirelli's heart hammered against his ribs. He shuffled to the door, playing the part of the frail old man. He opened it. Standing there was Dr. Michael Aldrich. He was holding a small wrapped package. "Mr. McNally," Aldrich said, his voice smooth and sympathetic, "I'm from the Veterans Outreach Program. We have a gift for you, a small token for your service." It was a lie, but a perfect one. Pirelli let him in. Aldrich's eyes scanned the room, taking in the details, the staged poverty, the atmosphere of despair. He seemed satisfied. "I understand you had a difficult time," Aldrich said, his voice a low hypnotic murmur. "The train derailment, 2:24 p.m., a moment that defined you, a moment that trapped you." Pirelli, as McNally, mumbled agreement, his hand resting near the pistol tucked into the back of his pants. "I'm here to offer you peace," Aldrich said, and from his pocket he drew not a weapon, but a watch, an old silver pocket watch. Its face was already cracked. To stop the time, to end the memory. He moved with a sudden, shocking speed, not towards Pirelli, but towards the kitchen. He turned on the gas stove without lighting it, the hiss of escaping gas immediately filling the small apartment. His plan was to stage a gas leak, a tragic accident, with the broken watch as his signature. It was his most elegant murder yet. "It's over, Aldrich," Pirelli said, dropping the old man act and straightening up, his service revolver now in his hand. Aldrich froze, his back to Pirelli. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "Detective Pirelli," he said without turning around, "I must say this is a crude attempt. You think like a policeman. You don't understand the poetry." "I understand you've murdered 4 people," Pirelli said, his finger on the trigger. "Turn around slowly. You're under arrest." As Aldrich turned, he let the pocket watch fall from his hand. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crack, the sound echoing the hiss of the gas. In that split second, as Pirelli's eyes flicked down to the watch, Aldrich lunged. He wasn't coming for Pirelli. He was going for the door. Pirelli tackled him, and the 2 men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The struggle was brief and violent. Aldrich was strong, fueled by a fanatic's energy, but Pirelli had desperation and a cop's training on his side. He managed to get Aldrich in cuffs just as Kowalski and the surveillance team burst through the door, guns drawn. The gas was shut off. The room was cleared. Dr. Michael Aldrich, the brilliant psychiatrist, sat on the floor, his expensive suit rumpled, a thin trickle of blood from his lip. But he was smiling. "You stopped me, Detective," Aldrich said, his voice calm. "But you haven't stopped the idea. The world is full of broken people, living lives of quiet desperation, trapped in a single moment. I was giving them release. I was a physician to the soul." "You're a murderer," Pirelli spat, his body trembling with adrenaline and rage. "I am a chronologist," he corrected him, his eyes gleaming with insane conviction. "And time is the ultimate killer. I was merely its instrument." They had him. They had him on attempted murder, breaking and entering, and the partial fingerprint from the Nobili crime scene was a perfect match. The case, it seemed, was closed. The trap has worked. Dr. Michael Aldrich is in custody, caught in the act of attempting to murder a fictional victim. The chronologist has been unmasked and stopped. The city can breathe again. But as Aldrich is led away, he speaks not like a captured killer, but like a triumphant philosopher. He claims his work was a mercy, a holy mission. Has justice truly been served, or has a complex, twisted ideology merely been interrupted? The trial will be a spectacle, but for Detective Pirelli, the echoes of the broken watches will linger long after the cell door slams shut. To witness the final psychological confrontation and the haunting legacy of the case, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The arrest of Dr. Michael Aldrich was the biggest story in Chicago. The press had a field day. Socialite shrink is clockmaker killer. The public was equal parts horrified and fascinated. The trial was a foregone conclusion. The evidence, especially from the sting operation, was overwhelming. Aldrich was convicted on 4 counts of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole at Stateville Penitentiary. For Detective Leo Pirelli, it was supposed to be the end. The puzzle was solved. The pieces fit. He had his commendation, his restored reputation, the gratitude of the city. But the satisfaction he craved never came. The words Aldrich had spoken in that gas-fueled apartment, "I was a physician to the soul," echoed in his mind, a haunting refrain. He visited Aldrich in prison once, a month after the sentencing. He found him in a sterile visiting room, looking paler but no less composed. He was reading a book on theoretical physics. "Come to gloat, detective?" Aldrich asked, setting the book down. "I came to understand," Pirelli replied, sitting across from him. "Why, really? Was it all just about your mentor, about proving his theory?" Aldrich smiled his thin, superior smile. "Silva understood the fundamental truth of existence, that we are not continuous beings. We are a series of moments, and most of us get stuck in one. My work was an act of profound compassion. I found those who were already ghosts, trapped in a past moment, and I set them free. The watch was merely a receipt, proof that their account with time had been settled." "You're insane," Pirelli said. But the words felt hollow. "Am I?" He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Think of Bellini, living in the shadow of a fire he caused. Jennings, a walking corpse since the stage fell. Vance, a hero forever drowning in that river. Noble, his world ending in a flash of light and sound. Were they truly alive, detective? Or were they just waiting for someone to acknowledge that their time had already run out?" Pirelli had no answer. He left the prison feeling more unsettled than when he had entered. Aldrich's philosophy was a poison, but it was a poison with a perverse internal logic. He had forced Pirelli to see the victims not just as corpses, but as people whose lives had been irrevocably broken long before he killed them. The case was closed, but it wouldn't leave him. He found himself looking at people on the street, wondering what moment had broken them. He saw the city not as a map of streets, but as a graveyard of frozen time. Aldrich had infected him with his way of seeing. A year passed. Pirelli tried to move on to other cases, but his heart wasn't in it. He was known as the man who caught the clockmaker, a legend, but he felt like a fraud. He had stopped a killer, but he hadn't silenced the idea. The final postscript to the case came on a rainy afternoon. A package arrived for him at the precinct with no return address. Inside was a small velvet box. With the sense of dread, Pirelli opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was a watch. A beautiful, antique silver pocket watch. It was not broken. The hands were moving, ticking off the seconds with a soft, precise sound. There was no note. Pirelli stared at it, his blood turning to ice. He knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that it was from Aldrich, a message from his prison cell, a final mocking gesture. The unbroken watch was more terrifying than all the broken ones combined. It was a statement. It meant that for Aldrich, the game wasn't over, that time itself was still moving, that there were still broken souls waiting for their release, that the philosophy was alive even if the philosopher was caged. Pirelli held the watch in his hand, feeling its steady, relentless tick against his palm. He had won. He had caught the killer, but as he listened to the soft, insistent ticking in the quiet of his office, he knew that some wounds, some ideas, never truly heal. The chronologist is in prison, but his clock is still ticking. The killer is behind bars, but his ideology remains a ghost in the machine of Detective Pirelli's mind. The arrival of an unbroken ticking watch is a final chilling message that the concept of the chronologist is not so easily imprisoned. The case is closed, but the psychological war is not over. Has Pirelli truly stopped a monster,
Or has he merely become the latest person to be trapped in the killer's twisted timeline? The legacy of the broken watches is a scar on the city and on the soul of the detective who solved the case. This concludes the chronicle of the Clockmaker. For more deep dives into the darkest corners of the criminal mind and the investigations that haunt the detectives who solve them, your search for understanding continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We are always exploring the shadows where justice and obsession collide.